It seems like memory is recording when we're just recording the world, but memory is a story. And I've even heard that memories change every time you remember them.
Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and today I'm here with Grant Faulkner. Grant is the co-founder of Memoir Nation and also the co-host of that Memoir Nation podcast. He is the co-founder of the Flash Fiction Institute, the co-founder of 100 Word Stories. I mean, all these co-founder things. I think he works well with other people, and an executive
Hope so.
producer on America's Next Great Author. And he was the executive director of National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, for 12 years. Grant, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Thank you so much. And I do get, when I hear my bio read, I'm like, that's a lot of co-founding, but it's much better than just founding, you know?
Yeah, it's fun to do things with other people.
Yeah.
Well, I think that your Memoir Nation work is really interesting, and we were sort of talking about that before when we were talking about having you on as a guest, and,
hmm
how writing memoir can be really different from writing other things. So can you sort of talk us through that?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because when I first started the podcast with Brooke Warner, who co-founded Memoir Nation with me, and we initially called it Right Minded back when you were our first guest, I think, maybe second guest. Anyway, that was
Early.
fun. But we rebranded it Memoir Nation when we decided to launch Memoir Nation, the organization. And early in the podcast, I hadn't read a lot of memoirs. Brooke was kind of our resident memoir scholar. She's been very passionate about them for a very long time. And so I used to just say, it's all storytelling, storytelling in memoir and storytelling in fiction. It's just pretty much the same, more or less. But then I wrote my own memoir, or I'm still writing it. And the more that I read other memoirs, I realize, yes, that is true. It is storytelling in its fundamental form, but it's a different type of storytelling because you're telling your story and you're trying to tell the truth. You're trying to have it be nonfiction. I think we all have storytellers' brains, though, and there's a fallibility built into how we view the world, right? I mean, and I'm sure you've experienced the same. Some people tell different stories about the same experience.
Oh my gosh, I have a funny story about that. So, I am adopted, and when I met my, biological parents separately, they had very different stories about the night I was conceived. I won't go into the
Mm.
details, but, like, you wouldn't even think it was the same event.
That is so interesting. And it's so when it happens to you, I mean, it's so perplexing, right? Because like it seems like memory is recording, and we're just recording the world. But memory is a story. And I've even heard that memories change every time you remember them. You're rewriting them. You're putting a re-story or restorying them. I think Lydia Yuknavitch coined that term. And and yeah, and so I think like there is a fallibility or a fictionality to the way we view the world. It's going through when we experience something, it's going through a lot of different filters.
Yeah, and you can tell a different story for a different audience too. When I talk
hmm
about my background as a writer versus my background as an entrepreneur, it can be a very different sounding story.
Right, exactly. You change your story for the audience. That's a really good point. And you change it. That's the thing about writing your story too, is like I found in my memoir, my story, the way I've conceived it, changes in the writing of it. And that's
Does it?
because, yeah, it's very fascinating how because I'm triggering different memories, I'm unearthing them, and I'm also remembering them differently. I think to your point that I'm presenting them on the page for a hopeful audience, which is different than just having them in my interior. And
Yeah.
so it's an interesting process. And I know, some memoirs have gone, like David Carr for his memoir, A Night of the Gun. He was going back. He's a New York Times reporter, sober for like 2 decades, and he went back into his years of addiction to try to figure out, who he was in that period. And so he brought all of his reporting talents to interview people who shared those experiences, but beyond them having different versions, they were also addicted to drugs. So there were some things that could not be figured out, including the night of the gun is like what happened with that gun that night. So yeah, it's very interesting what happens to us.
'Cause memories are fuzzy. So
hmm
when you're working with people to write their memoir, do you does how much work goes into figuring out who the audience really is. Like, you imagine
Hmm.
a lot of different people write the book, but as a memoir writer, you probably different people have different audiences in mind.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think one of the principles of writing a memoir is that no matter, we all have unique stories, and some of our stories are so unique, that almost no one on earth has experienced them, right? Certain types of trauma, for instance. And so you're always writing, the general guidance is to write with a sense of universality. So if I haven't had a child who died at 7 years old because of some tragic illness, I can still read that memoir and it will speak to me, like on some level. And so yeah, it's both. I think like some memoirists though probably are, thinking that they'll reach more of a prime demographic depending on the subject matter that they're dealing with. But I think that universality is something to really reach for and try to achieve.
So you probably won't be successful if you're writing it. I really want to make sure grandma reads this so she realizes what she's done.
I,
You
I,
know?
I, I, yeah, well, yeah, exactly. You're not, there's a lot of warnings about not to write revenge memoirs, especially if you're going to publish them for a wider audience, because you lose credibility. People don't trust your point of view if you're the righteous one, like I did it all right. Grandma was wrong. Grandma was mean and cruel. Yeah, so we all have, whatever. There are villains in the world, and you can feel them as evil and bad characters, but I think you have to reach to find their humanity and their point of view. This goes back to my novel writing days, but one bit of advice in writing villains for novels is that villains don't see themselves as villains. You know, they
Right.
they think they rationalize their acts. This is like one of the disappointing things about humans, is that we're brilliant at rationalizing the things we do to make them right for us. So I think you have to write characters and try to observe all their contradictions and find their goodness, because I do think almost everybody, if not everybody, has some goodness in them. So yeah, I think that's the toughest part though with memoirs, because so many memoirs really are about being wronged or victimized in some way, and so that's really hard to do.
Yeah. I'm thrusting this question on you
Yeah.
unprepared, but I've long pondered what the difference is between a villain and a monster. It's more of a general fiction question, but I wonder if you have thoughts on the difference
Gosh,
between those
this
two.
is this is a fast. I've never thought of this, to tell you the truth. A villain and a monster. So I mean, a monster. I mean, it's a funny word, right? Because you can act monstrously, right?
Mhm.
A villain can act monstrously but not be a monster. Maybe that's it. Maybe a monster is pure evil, and maybe a villain is a human being with many kinds of sides and angles and passions and loves and contradictions. Does
Yeah,
that
so in
work?
a
Does
mem
that work?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No, I'm
Yeah.
thinking yeah. So maybe in a memoir, you could, try to avoid turning people into monsters
Exactly.
and explore their villainy
Yeah, I like
with
that.
with compassion
You're
or
you're good with
understanding.
words.
I know, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head the origin of either of those words, but it's probably revealing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love it. I love it. Listeners should know I've been trying to get Mignon to write. She has written at least part of one novel, and
I have.
I've been trying to nudge her into finishing it. So hopefully, you've got plenty of monsters and villains that will draw you back to the page.
Yeah, that is actually one of the problems I have with my quarter written novel is I can't decide who the villain is and
Mm,
why what motivates them. And all the motivations seem too small to me. And then I read other people's novels and their villains' motivations aren't, earth-shattering. It can be something as simple
yeah,
as, petty academic rivalries
it
or
can.
plain small greed, but for some reason, I feel like my villain has to be, the world's worst ever.
Yeah, no, I'm much more interested in petty grudges than I am in grand villainy. I mean, I think
Yeah.
like because most humans hold petty grudges for no one's benefit, including their own, usually. I think that's what's interesting about a lot of the antagonism between humans is that sometimes neither side wins.
Yeah, so often.
Hmm.
Yeah. So what else makes writing a memoir different from writing a or not writing a novel?
Yeah. Really living in the golden age of memoirs. I think this kind of golden age started in the 90s. and 80s and 90s. And I think one a lot of people approach memoir as if it's an autobiography. And so I think like the reason that one can be like 43 years old and have 7 memoirs is that memoirs are actually like slices of life. They're about experiences, and they can be small or large. So I think like sometimes people think, maybe like you did with your villain, that you need to have this tremendous villain. And I think a lot of people hesitate to write their memoirs because they think their life is too ordinary or boring. And that, of course, is false. I mean, just like, as I said it when I was at NaNoWriMo, is everyone has a story to tell. And you just have to believe that your story matters to write it. And that goes for memoir too. And I think like there have been plenty of memoirs that aren't about anything extraordinary happening. They're just interrogations of the self. And so I think I find that very interesting. And I think that I'll say one more thing on a societal level. What I find really interesting, what really drew me to memoir, to starting this organization, um, was I thought about the changes, the genuine cultural changes I've felt in my lifetime. And a lot of them have been driven by memoirs, by people telling their truth. And I think like memoirs have addressed so many taboos in our society, whether it's sexual orientation, addiction to drugs, sexual abuse, sexual trauma. Just the list can just is so long. But memoirs really kind of broke through and addressed those taboos. And a lot of memoirists personally suffered, presenting their story for a variety of reasons. They were pilloried, like what do they call it? Trauma porn,
Oh,
and I think obviously I think a lot of memoirists are women, and so I think that they're being vulnerable and telling these stories. They've been unfortunately, sexism has kind of tried to diminish their stories, but I think we've had so many important stories that have changed the world. Meaning that we have gay marriage because there were a lot of memoirs about that. And story. I always say stories precede policies. And so that's why I think the stories really are the most important thing that we have to give the world to change it.
yeah. When we were
Hmm.
preparing, you talked about the fragmentation of language to express trauma. And I have to
Hmm.
confess, I didn't really know what you meant by that.
Yeah. So actually, they've done psychological studies on this, and when somebody experiences trauma, they don't experience it like a normal cohesive like narrative. Like if you haven't experienced trauma, your narrative of what has happened to you is generally like an arrow. It's one thing moving forward with a beginning, middle, and end. And it has a sense of resolution oftentimes too. That's the expectation of a narrative, a cohesive narrative. But trauma, when somebody's experienced trauma, you experience a more splintered, fractured world that is full of shards. And so oftentimes in the remembering of the trauma, you don't have the language really. There's not a language to express that trauma. So the sentence structure or the narrative structure can really break down. It can be really very, very fragmented. For instance, like oftentimes people use like really short sentences. Sometimes they use dashes where language fails them. Oftentimes they use the passive voice, and usually the passive voice isn't encouraged or a good thing to use, but it obviously has its place, right? And so if you've been victimized in some way or harmed, you're more in the helpless. So the passive voice helps explain that. And one way that I think about this, just to put it into a personal story, not my story, but I interviewed Amanda Knox on our Memoir Nation podcast, or we did. And for listeners who might not know that name, she was part of this kind of global, horrible scandal in the early 2000s, where she was an 18 or 19-year-old college student who was studying in Italy. And in like the second or third week, while she was there, her roommate died this horrific bloody death, and Amanda was accused of it. Turned out, she was exonerated later, but she spent 4 years in prison. And what she said on the podcast is that what was interesting to her as somebody who experienced this trauma was that she lost the sense of herself as a protagonist. So, and I think most people think of themselves as a protagonist in their life. And so they think of their life having this kind of cohesive story and following this path. And she lost that sense of herself as a protagonist. And I think that's what oftentimes happens with people who experience trauma. And so since we're using language to both express ourselves, but also mirror our experiences, that's where language really fails us in a way, or the conventional rules of language fail us. And that's where I think a lot of writers then have to experiment both with grammar and the structure of their narrative in order to try to express, what they went through. So yeah, it's very interesting to me. I should note that this idea, I first heard it from, I mean, there is a lot of psychological research on it. I first heard it from Adam Johnson, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, and he gave this presentation once. And I think he recognized this as a creative writing instructor, that his students who had experienced trauma, their narratives were just different than other students. And so he presented a lot of this. Very fascinating.
When people go through this trauma, does it affect their memory and how they even remember the stories? And then, how can you write about it when you maybe remember it differently or can't remember all of it?
Yeah, I think from what I've read is that experiencing trauma is more about reaction than reflection. You're still caught up in the trauma, you haven't moved beyond it. And so, like, a flashback intrudes on your life. It's a disruptive thing. You don't exactly invite that flashback in. And so in writing, that's the challenge of writing too, is how can you represent how trauma is a disruption that reoccurs over and over again. And so a lot of trauma narratives, there's a real circling through the trauma, a real like looping, having a loop through your brain. You're reliving it a lot. And I think, I was reflecting on if or when I've done this in my own writing, and I went through some very severe insomnia when I was in my 20s, and I still carry it with me for the most part. But I wrote a story that was very focused on a character's insomnia, and I really did get into like presenting things with a different syntax, like because when you have insomnia, it's like you're both neither awake or asleep. You're in this different zone. Your circadian rhythms aren't really obeying the circadian rhythms of the world. And so, like, I really did have to break down language to an extent because, like, also when you have insomnia, just your perceptions are so different, and you're having a lot of these intrusive thoughts, and you're trying to calm down, and you have this simultaneity too, where a lot of things are happening at once, which is similar to kind of the stream of consciousness that Virginia Woolf or William Faulkner really were groundbreaking authors with. And so it was interesting to try to represent that very splintered world. So I think it was similar to trauma when I had insomnia.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I imagine that the writing isn't all fragmented in the memoir. Even in a trauma
Mhm.
memoir, it probably shifts into the fragmentation at certain points, but then other parts are more normally or standardly narrative.
Very good point. And one interesting thing about trauma narratives too is that to express them, it has all that kind of splintering of language that I've mentioned. But there's also a lot of theories that to try to make a cohesive whole of your experience is the way to heal, or the best way to heal. So it's interesting how storytellers we use stories to express ourselves, but we also use them to heal ourselves.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you also mentioned that the fragmentation writing, it comes up in something called a flash novel, and I don't know what a flash
Mhm.
novel is. So you said they're big now. So what is a flash novel?
Flash novel and flash memoir, yeah, the whole kind of flash aesthetic, I think, is taking off in a lot of ways. And I think it was about 10 years ago, I was on a panel with some highfalutin literary critics, and I mentioned the phrase flash novel, and I was scolded for using it because I was told that that's impossible. And so, just for listeners' sake, because a lot of people don't know what flash fiction is, it's technically stories 1,000 words or less. And so it is a fragmentary story form by definition. And you're focused on brevity and compression and writing with constraints. I believe that constraints bring out a different type of creativity. And I don't know why it's a popular storytelling form right now. Like, I founded the journal, or co-founded 100 Word Story about 15 years ago, and it's led for me to an obsession on the short form. And I wrote a book called The Art of Brevity as well. And I think there's something about the kind of just our kind of pixelated consciousness, I guess, like the internet is constant movement through stories. The world is kind of blurry and distracting, And we experience the world, I think, kind of like a collage where we're getting all these little snapshots of life. And that's the way my memory also works. It's like a collage of snapshots. And so I think that there is a mimetic reason to write like Flash. But I think there's also something happening larger in the cultural world and with the internet. Because when I notice this a lot, and this is totally anecdotal, but I noticed that the Flash form is super popular with writers under 30, you know? And I
Mhm.
think that there's just something happening. I can't really express what it is. Um, but it has become a trend, you know, like it used to be a sort of rare way to write a story is through this kind of elliptical stitching together of fragments. But recently, especially in the last like 5 years or so, I read a lot of novels that take this form, and more memoirs. And I think like on one hand, it can look like an easier way to write a book, but it's actually a much more difficult way.
Yeah, I think it would be harder.
Yeah, I think it's harder. I think it's deceptive. I think like I've even read authors who've said, you know, like oh gosh, Mary Robeson, she wrote oh, I'm forgetting what novel she wrote, but she wrote it all on little note cards.
Yeah.
And she said all the note cards could just be shuffled in any order and it would be fine. But I think she was wrong. I actually think she was wrong. I think the ordering of the note cards and the way that you're developing character escalation and plot escalation, all those things matter, no matter if you're writing in an experimental form or not. So, yeah.
Well, it reminds me too, I think that, there used to be novels that were based on letters that people wrote back to each other,
Yeah.
like epistolaries.
Yeah.
And there's a new one that's popular
The
right now.
correspondent.
Yes, that's it, The Correspondent.
Yes.
I was trying to look it up and see what it
Do you,
was.
do you know why I know that?
Why?
Beyond it being an internet sensation and number one on the whatever best-selling lists, I wrote an epistolary novel like 10 years ago, and
Really?
I've been trying to sell it. It is going to come out in a year or so, but everybody told me no one wanted to read an epistolary novel. You know, so I was like, finally, The Correspondent got published, and I was like, yes, they do want to read it. You can tell a story, and that's why I wrote it. Actually, it is a type of flash novel, you know. And so with the flash novel, the reason, just looping back to that question that you
Yeah.
asked, so I've used it a lot recently and thought about it a lot recently because I have this book, Something Out There in the Distance, that just came out. And they are these little flash stories that are told to my friend Gail Butensky's photos. So I like the form because it's this interplay or this conversation between stories and photos. And so this form itself are all these little snippets and fragments that to me they add up into something not bigger. So a flash novel is operating with these small little stories but creating something bigger. And I call it a flash novel because it's my text, but these photos also give it kind of like the feeling of a film, and that my text is like a voiceover for that. So there's no technical definition for flash novel. It's more about an aesthetic, I think.
And do you distinguish between flash fiction and a flash novel, or is a flash novel just a thousand word or fewer piece of fiction?
Yeah, I think a flash novel is more about like flash fiction does have this kind of technical definition of stories under 1,000 words, and a lot of the subgenres of that are like 100 word story or 6 word stories. They all are these kind of different subcontainers. Whereas a flash novel doesn't have that type of definition. I mean, I think my novel is like about 7,000 words, so not many words. And I think a typical novella or novel is like about 50,000 words, 40 or 50 for a novella. Um, so yeah, I think for me, it's more a matter of that aesthetic and what you can do with brevity and what you can do with linked stories, and that's why I call it a flash novel, because I don't think it's not really a short story, and so I think it's something bigger than that.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna ask you next. So how does it differ from a short story? But you're piecing together different parts. It's not one contiguous story, right? It's more like little pieces together
Pretty
for
much. I mean,
yours.
it could technically be called a short story, you know, like 7,000 words falls in that. But it's presented in a book, and it's also presented with white space, and it's formatted differently. And so it has this kind of prose poem feel. And like I said, it's like the one character's voiceover that accompanies the photos. So I like to think that you could read it and feel like you went to a movie.
Mm. So to wrap up, what advice, other than listening to Memoir Nation, your podcast, what advice do you have for people who are interested in writing a memoir?
Yeah, I think So often, I think you have to believe in yourself as a writer, and you have to believe in your story. And I think I say that because so many people will say, "I don't have a story to tell," or "My story is not interesting." But the fact is that we are storytelling creatures. That is the definition of being human. And all you have to do is identify the stories and be interested in the stories, and then start writing the stories. And you won't do that unless you believe that you're a writer and that you're a storyteller. So really, it's about identifying the stories in your life, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, and just being interested in believing in yourself and believing that there's a benefit for you to tell that story. I mean, I never really think in terms of like money that you're going to make from a story, or making the bestseller list, or any of that. Fame, fortune doesn't matter, because you're really writing the story as a gift to yourself to start with. But then if you want to get it out there, whether it's like earlier you mentioned the grandma who was evil or something, you can also write the story. You probably could write that story just for your family, if everyone experienced her like that.
You wanted to blow everything up.
Hopefully you have other things to say too, but no, I think I love, actually Memoir Nation started because when my father died, I said if he would have written just 10,000 words about his life, it would have been the most precious thing he left us, and so I want to help people tell that level of story. But also, yeah, publish memoirs too. I mean, often we, as writers, we want to put it out there for readers. And so I think, yeah, believing that this story is going to resonate with a reader, that you're going to be able to, that your story matters on that level. Yeah. So I think that's the main thing. Is just jumping in too. Don't get hung up on the rules. Don't think you need to take a lot of classes. Don't even think you need to join Memoir Nation. The main thing is just to sit down and write and develop a practice. And once you develop a practice, you'll find inspiration, and you'll find an invitation to write every day, or whatever, often.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grant.
Hmm.
Grant Faulkner, where can people find you and your books and all your projects?
I think pretty much just do a search on the internet. I'm all over the usual places. The webcast, I mean, memoirnation.com, grantfaulkner.com. Do that search. You can join Memoir Nation, find all about it on the website, of course, and my books are available all the usual places.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you too to the Grammar Pelusians who support the show. We have
Mm.
a bonus segment for you that you'll find in your feed. Grant and I, you heard me mention white space. We're going to talk about white space as a type of grammar in a story.
Mm.
And we're going to talk about joining writing challenges. So, how you can, get that motivation to write. So, look for that in your feed. And thank you for your support. If you want to become a Grammar Pelusian, visit patreon.com/grammargirl. Thanks so much.